Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Lately, it feels like everywhere you turn, you hear about this global cost of living crisis. And it's not just headlines, it's hitting all of us right where it hurts
Yeah.
in our wallets. So today, we're going to do a deep dive into this. We've got this excerpt from an article. It's called The Global Cost of Living Crisis, a Deepening Challenge. And yeah, it gets pretty real. Just to give you a taste, global inflation, it surged to about 9% in 2022. 9%. Remember those days when you go to the grocery store and like everything was suddenly 20% more expensive?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's inflation in action, silently shrinking the value of our hard-earned money.
Yeah.
So we're not just going to like rehash the headlines here. We're going to really try to figure out why this matters to you and, most importantly, what can you actually do about it?
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that this is way more than just numbers on a page. It's about people's everyday realities, like all around the world.
Absolutely. And the article breaks down these key factors driving this whole crisis.
Yeah.
And it kind of all starts with this thing, inflation.
Yeah, it's almost like a silent thief, right? Just keeps chipping away at your purchasing power, making those everyday essentials harder and harder to afford. And, we have to remember that 9%, that's just a global average. Some countries are getting hit way harder than others.
Right, right. And it's not just some far-off problem either. Think about all those energy bills we've all been getting. Ouch, right. Well, that's the global energy crisis hitting us right here at home.
And you can't talk about energy without talking about what's happening in Ukraine. The war has really thrown a wrench into things, especially for Europe. They relied heavily on Russia for oil and gas, so this really shows us just how connected our world truly is.
Absolutely. And then there's the issue of food, like just getting enough to eat. The FAO, they reported that global food prices hit near record highs in 2022. And the article talks about all these factors: climate change, weird weather, fertilizer shortages. It all leads to these higher costs for agriculture. And guess who ends up paying for it? We do.
It really makes you think, how do we build food systems that can handle these global shocks? This isn't a one-time thing. It's a challenge that's not going away anytime soon.
Definitely. And then there's housing. Rents going through the roof,
Mm.
owning a home, forget about it. It feels completely out of reach, especially for us younger folks.
Mhm.
The article mentions the US, Canada, Europe, but this is everywhere.
It's that classic supply and demand issue, right? You've got all these cities where the number of people who need housing totally outstrips the available places to live. Prices just skyrocket. And that's where you really see how this crisis plays out differently for different folks.
Yeah, for sure. And we can't leave out wages. It's not just that they're not keeping up with inflation. It's the kinds of jobs out there these days. So many of them are in these like low wage sectors with no real chance to move up. The income gap, it's just getting wider.
It's like this vicious cycle, it really is. And this uneven impact is playing out on a global scale, too. The gap between developed and developing countries, it's becoming even more stark.
The article mentions this thing called fuel poverty in the UK. You got families over there struggling to afford both food and heating their homes. So even in richer countries, people are getting squeezed.
Absolutely. And in developing countries, the situation is even more dire. Food and energy prices are soaring, and that can push millions of people deeper into poverty. And if there aren't those safety nets in place, the consequences are truly devastating. Places like sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, parts of Latin America, they're especially vulnerable.
It's like this ripple effect hitting those who are already struggling the hardest.
Exactly. And then it all ties into this larger issue of global inequality. This cost of living crisis is widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots. It's happening within countries and between countries. It's like these economic shocks come along and they just magnify the inequalities that already exist.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack,
Yeah.
right? But the article doesn't just leave us hanging with problems. It actually offers up some potential solutions. And they're not all doom and gloom.
Yeah, it's really about finding ways to tackle these problems head on, and not just as individual countries, but as a global community.
Definitely. One solution they talk about is targeted social assistance. Like, governments can directly help those in need. We're talking about cash transfers, food programs, subsidies for things like energy and housing.
Remember those energy relief measures they put in place in the EU? They capped electricity and gas prices to help people cope with those crazy bills. It's a great example of how targeted help can actually make a difference.
That's really interesting. And then there's this thing called monetary policy adjustments.
Right, so that's where central banks come in. They have to find that sweet spot where they're controlling inflation, but not like causing a whole recession. It's about looking at the big economic picture.
It's all connected, right?
Right.
But like you said, it's not all on individual countries. The article talks about the importance of like global cooperation. especially when it comes to energy and food. We're all in this together, so working together on things like, finding different energy sources and stabilizing food supplies, that's crucial.
Absolutely. It's realizing that these challenges go way beyond any single country's borders. We need a global effort to build a future that's sustainable and resilient.
And then, of course, there's the issue of affordable housing.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's about thinking differently about how we design our cities, increasing the supply of affordable housing, especially in places where populations are booming. That can help take some of the pressure off.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
And lastly, the article dives into the need for these long-term economic reforms. Investing in things like education, job training, healthcare. It's about creating a global economy that's more equitable.
It's laying the groundwork for a future that's both inclusive and, sustainable.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. What are some of the key takeaways you'd like to highlight for our listeners?
Well, first off, it's important to understand that this cost of living crisis is a complicated beast. There are all these factors at play, and the consequences are far-reaching. Second, this impact isn't equal. Vulnerable populations are getting hit harder, and this is exacerbating global inequality. But finally, and this is important, there is hope. We have options, we have potential solutions. This is a call to action for policymakers, individuals, communities, for all of us to work together to build a future that's more equitable and sustainable.
I love that. Before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. How might climate change make this cost of living crisis even worse in the coming years? We'll be tackling that and much more in our next segment, so stay tuned.
Yeah, that's a great question because climate change, it's like it takes all these existing problems and just makes them so much worse. It adds this whole other layer to the cost of living crisis.
Okay, so how exactly would climate change make things worse? Like, can you give us some specifics?
Well, think about things like extreme weather. Like hurricanes and floods and droughts. They're getting more and more frequent and intense, all thanks to climate change. And they can just wreck agricultural production.
Right, so then we end up with food shortages.
Yeah.
And prices go up.
Yeah.
And we were already talking about how food is such a big part of this whole cost of living crisis. So climate change basically just throws gasoline on the fire.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just food. Extreme weather can also damage all that infrastructure, disrupt all those complicated supply chains that get us everything, even displace entire communities. And all of this just adds to economic instability, which ultimately drives up the cost of living.
So it's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
Climate change triggers these crazy events, and then those effects ripple through the whole global economy.
Exactly. And we also have to think about rising sea levels. Coastal communities are facing an increasing risk of flooding and erosion. Think about the damage to property, people having to move, higher insurance costs.
It's a big deal, especially for those folks living in those low-lying areas. It's not some far-off future problem either. It's happening right now in some parts of the world.
You're absolutely right. And then there's the impact on energy prices. As we transition away from those fossil fuels, which we have to do, there are probably going to be periods of volatility and those prices might fluctuate.
So even though moving to renewable energy is essential in the long run, it could make energy less affordable in the short term.
Yeah, but we can't forget that sticking with fossil fuels has a way bigger cost in the long run for the planet and our wallets. Doing nothing about climate change is way more expensive than transitioning to clean energy.
Yet that's a really important point. Those short-term challenges can't distract us from fixing the root of the problem.
Exactly. And that's where innovation and investment come in. We need to be developing and using those clean energy technologies way faster. We got to make our homes and businesses more energy efficient and build infrastructure that can handle a changing climate.
So we need solutions that address the things we're experiencing right now, like those high prices, but also address the root causes, including climate change.
Precisely. It's a multifaceted challenge, so we need to think about it holistically.
So if climate change can make this cost of living crisis even worse,
Yeah.
what does that mean for the average person just trying to get by in this crazy world?
Well, it just shows how urgent it is to deal with climate change. It's not just about saving the environment. It's about economics. It's about social issues, security, everything.
So it's about our own well-being, our own economic security.
Exactly. And it means we all need to start adapting to a changing climate, making our homes more energy efficient, using less fossil fuels, supporting those policies that make us more resilient to climate change.
So we need to make changes in our own lives,
Right.
but also push for bigger changes.
You got it.
Right.
And we need to hold our leaders accountable for addressing this crisis. We need to be demanding policies that promote clean energy, sustainable agriculture, affordable housing, and those safety nets that help the most vulnerable.
So using our voices and our votes to make real change.
Exactly. We can't just sit back and watch. We all have a role to play in building a better future.
This has been a really insightful conversation. I feel like we're just getting started, though.
Yeah, we've definitely laid the groundwork for understanding how the cost of living crisis and climate change are connected, but there's always more to explore.
And that's what these deep dives are all about, right? We give our listeners a jumping off point, and then you can keep digging, asking questions, and really engaging with these important topics.
And that's how we make real change, informed action, and collective effort.
Okay, before we wrap up this part, I have one last question for you. How might this cost of living crisis change global migration patterns in the years to come?
That's a really interesting question. Migration is a really complex thing. There are so many factors involved. But yeah, as the cost of living goes up, it's going to make people think about moving, especially those who are already struggling in those regions where the crisis is hitting the hardest.
So it's like they're being forced to leave their homes because they just can't afford to live there anymore.
Yeah, kind of. When you can't even afford basic necessities, you have to make some really tough choices. And for some folks, migration, even with all the risks, might start to look like the only option, at least a chance for a better life.
It's pretty intense when you think about it.
It really is. And then you add climate change to the mix, and things get even more complicated. We've already talked about how climate change can lead to food shortages, water scarcity, those extreme weather events, and all of these can force people to move. It's what they call climate migration.
So you're saying that climate change could actually make more people migrate.
Exactly. It's like a double whammy. Economic hardship plus climate change creates this perfect storm for migration.
That's a scary thought. So where do you see this playing out in the future?
It's hard to say for sure, but we can look at the places that are already dealing with these issues, like parts of sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Central America. They're already vulnerable to economic problems and climate change.
So we might see more people migrating from those regions to places with better opportunities.
It's definitely possible. But you have to remember that migration patterns are affected by a whole bunch of things, like political stability, social networks, immigration policy.
Right, it's not a simple equation. But even if we don't know exactly what's going to happen, it sounds like migration is going to be a major issue.
Absolutely. And it raises all these questions about how we're going to deal with it. How do we address the root causes of migration? Things like poverty, inequality, climate change. How do we make sure migrants are treated with dignity and respect? And how do we manage migration so that it benefits everyone involved?
Wow, those are some big questions.
They really are, and they require everyone to work together. We need international cooperation, smart policies, and a commitment to creating a fair and sustainable world for everyone, no matter where they come from.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. We've learned so much about how the global cost of living crisis, climate change, and migration are all connected. It's clear that we need to pay attention to these challenges and take action.
Yeah, I totally agree. The more we understand these complicated issues, the better we can deal with them and create a more resilient and fair future for all.
And that's what we try to do here at the Deep Dive. We want to give you the knowledge to make a difference. We hope this episode has given you something to think about and maybe inspired you to learn more about these important topics.
Knowledge is power, and collective action can change the world.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another episode. Until then, stay curious, keep learning, and keep making a difference.